What if the most powerful interview of the decade was based on a lie, and now Oprah Winfrey says she was played? There was a time when Meghan Markle could do no wrong in the eyes of the American media. When she and Prince Harry sat down with Oprah Winfrey in that sun-drenched Montecito garden in 2021, it wasn't just a television event. It was a cultural earthquake. Oprah asked pointed questions. Meghan gave carefully paced answers, and the world gasped. Allegations of racism, mental anguish, and institutional cruelty echoed through households across continents. It was, many believed, a reckoning not just for the British royal family, but for the very way we consume and perceive power. And standing behind it all was Oprah, a woman long revered as the high priestess of truth-telling, nodding along, validating every whispered claim with a well-placed pause, a widened eye, a knowing silence. She wasn't just interviewing Meghan. She was, in the minds of millions, helping her heal and be heard. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But now, years later, something has shifted. What once stood tall as a monument to vulnerable storytelling has begun to crack at the base. And behind the polished exteriors of private jets and glossy covers, the people who helped shape Meghan's narrative are allegedly walking away, not in anger, but in sorrow. Among them are Oprah Winfrey herself and her closest confidant, Gayle King. This is not just another royal scandal. This is a collapse of trust that strikes at the very core of modern media and truth. It is a story about manipulation, loyalty, and the pain that follows when long-believed truths start to unravel before the very eyes of those who once fought to defend them. At the heart of it all is a single devastating realization. Oprah now reportedly believes she was used. And Gayle King, usually reserved in public matters of fallout, is not only backing her, she's helping expose what they both now see as a carefully manufactured performance. According to multiple insiders, Oprah's confidence in Meghan was not merely professional, it was deeply personal. She had gone out on a limb, put her name and journalistic credibility on the line, and invited Meghan into her most sacred space, the space where truth was meant to be honored. That interview wasn't just televised, it was historic. For a woman of Oprah's legacy, built over decades of telling hard stories with grace, discovering that she may have been fed rehearsed lines was more than embarrassing. It was heartbreaking. She told us this was her truth, a source close to the production reportedly said. But it wasn't truth, it was theater. And Oprah knows that now. The betrayal didn't come all at once. Like a leak in a dam, it started with hairline fractures. Minor details from Meghan's account didn't match palace records. Timelines began to raise questions. Specific events, like the now infamous conversation about Archie's skin tone, proved difficult to substantiate, even with extensive research. At first, Oprah reportedly chalked it up to trauma-induced fog. But as more and more discrepancies emerged, including rumors that Meghan's team had coached her through specific emotional beats for the interview, the fog began to clear. And what emerged was a version of the truth that looked far less organic, far less raw, and far more orchestrated than anyone had anticipated. For Gayle King, who had vocally supported Meghan and Harry both on and off air, the reckoning hit harder than most would imagine. Friends say she felt a growing sense of unease for months before any public fallout. She had staked her own reputation, subtly reinforcing Meghan's claims on CBS segments and lending her credibility to Meghan's narrative. But as Oprah's doubts grew more intense, Gayle reportedly began conducting her own quiet inquiries, calling mutual friends, reviewing old transcripts, and finally coming to a painful conclusion: they had both been played. You have to understand, one media executive confided, Gayle and Oprah don't just put their names on things. They embody them. And for Oprah to admit she feels used, that's not small. That's a spiritual injury. The turning point reportedly came during a private meeting between Oprah and Gayle in late spring. According to a source familiar with the conversation, the atmosphere was tense but intimate. Oprah, usually composed and deliberate in her speech, was emotional. "I let her into my world," she allegedly told Gayle, "and she performed for me." That conversation, insiders say, ended in tears not for Meghan, but for the loss of trust, the feeling of having been manipulated in front of a global audience. But how did we get here? To understand the magnitude of this unraveling, one must go back to that now legendary interview. Meghan didn't just share her story, she dropped bombshells. Accusations of royal racism, claims that her mental health pleas were ignored, and subtle suggestions that her child was treated differently because of his skin color all painted a damning picture. But what's now under scrutiny is not just the accuracy of those claims, but the method in which they were delivered. Reports suggest that Meghan may have rehearsed key moments, strategically planned pauses, and even fed Oprah lines through pre-interview conversations. While scripting isn't uncommon in high-profile interviews, it becomes problematic when it's presented as raw, unrehearsed truth. Oprah's initial defense of Meghan was unwavering. She doubled down when critics called for fact checks, and she leaned into her role as confidant and protector. But insiders now say that as she began receiving legal briefings, private notes, and rebuttals from palace insiders, she started to feel the walls closing in. And then came the email. According to reports, a former employee of Meghan's team allegedly leaked an internal message that described Meghan's strategy for the interview, including discussion topics, emotional emphasis points, and even potential responses to specific follow-ups from Oprah. The email, if authentic, suggests that Meghan's conversation wasn't just heartfelt, it was curated. And for Oprah, that was the final straw. "I believed her because I wanted to," Oprah reportedly told a close friend. "And that's my mistake." The backlash hasn't been public yet, not in the way tabloids love to feed on. Oprah, true to her nature, has chosen restraint. But those close to her say the rift is now permanent. She no longer speaks with Meghan, and Gayle, once a quiet Meghan supporter, has unfollowed her on key platforms and declined offers to appear on related panels. Even more tellingly, Oprah is said to be developing a new docuseries focusing on narrative manipulation in the modern era, a not-so-subtle way to address what she now views as a dangerous betrayal. In media circles, the implications are seismic. If Oprah, the gold standard of authentic storytelling, can be deceived, what does that say about the future of high-profile interviews? How many other narratives have been shaped behind closed doors, only to be consumed as truth by a public hungry for heroes and villains? As for Meghan, her camp has gone quiet. After years of dominating headlines, she's suddenly absent from the spotlight. No new interviews, no fresh statements, just silence, and the eerie sound of former allies slowly pulling away. This story isn't just about a friendship gone wrong. It's about the cost of trust in an age where personal brand often outweighs truth. Oprah gave Meghan a platform not just because she believed her, but because she believed in the power of giving voice to the voiceless. And now, with mounting evidence that the voice she amplified may have been performing all along, she's faced with a dilemma that strikes at the core of her life's work. The public deserves to know what happened behind the curtain. And that's exactly what this video aims to unpack. Every whisper, every quote, every quiet betrayal that led to one of the most unexpected media breakups of the decade. We'll explore how Gayle King became the unexpected whistleblower, what Oprah really thinks now about the 2021 interview, and how this fracture is reverberating through the entertainment and journalistic landscape. We'll also ask the uncomfortable but necessary question: was this whole story, from palace victimhood to American reinvention, built on a lie? Stay with us, because what comes next will shake everything you thought you knew about the royals, the media, and the woman who turned her truth into a global brand. Before the microphones, before the lighting rigs and the dramatic Montecito Garden interview, there was an alliance being forged, one so deliberate and mutually beneficial that few saw the potential danger brewing underneath. It was a friendship born not of long history or shared struggle, but of opportunity, brand alignment, and perhaps, more than anything else, the calculated merging of media power with narrative hunger. The world first caught wind of Meghan Markle's budding relationship with Oprah Winfrey sometime around 2018, shortly after Meghan's engagement to Prince Harry. At first, it seemed innocent enough, the friendly outreach of an American media titan extending her warmth to a fellow woman of color now entangled in the centuries-old machinery of the British monarchy. Oprah sent baby gifts, attended Meghan's wedding, and spoke highly of the couple in interviews. What wasn't widely known at the time was how carefully this relationship was being cultivated behind the scenes. Oprah Winfrey is not known to be careless with her alliances. She is strategic, disciplined, and perhaps more than any other public figure, deeply protective of her image. Her approval isn't handed out lightly. But in Meghan, Oprah saw something that resonated deeply, a woman who appeared to be breaking barriers in a system long viewed as impenetrable and antiquated. Meghan was American, biracial, outspoken, and seemingly the embodiment of modernity clashing with tradition. Oprah was intrigued, perhaps even enchanted. Sources close to Oprah's team have said that Meghan's outreach to the media mogul wasn't random. There were intermediaries involved, quiet meetings, carefully arranged introductions. Meghan, then newly married and still adjusting to royal life, had already begun looking for ways to shape her narrative on her own terms. The royal institution, she reportedly felt, stifled her voice. The palace PR machine was opaque, slow, and indifferent to her background or her American way of doing things. In Oprah, she saw a path around all that. The two women began to speak more frequently in private. At first, these conversations revolved around mutual interests, philanthropy, women's empowerment, and navigating media scrutiny. But the relationship, insiders say, quickly deepened into something far more transactional. Meghan didn't just want a friend in Oprah. She wanted a platform, a place where her version of events could be told without filters, without edits, and most importantly, without challenge. This is where Gayle King comes in. A veteran journalist with decades of broadcast experience, Gayle is Oprah's right hand, both professionally and personally. Wherever Oprah goes, Gayle isn't far behind. And as Meghan's integration into Oprah's world deepened, so too did her proximity to Gayle. For a while, the trio was seen as a kind of informal power circle, women who understood the challenges of public life, the weight of racial expectations, and the loneliness that comes with being held to impossible standards. In many ways, it was a natural fit. Meghan's struggles mirrored so many themes Oprah had explored over the years on her show. The emotional abuse, the institutional coldness, the longing for one's truth to be heard. Gayle, ever the supportive voice, echoed these sentiments in her broadcasts and defended Meghan on air when critics came calling. By the time 2020 arrived, the groundwork had been laid. Meghan and Harry had exited their royal duties, moved to California, and were actively redefining their public roles. They were no longer just royal figures, they were brands. And what better way to reintroduce themselves than through the most trusted woman in American media? The planning of the 2021 interview reportedly began long before any cameras rolled. According to those familiar with the production, Meghan's team was deeply involved in the logistics, tone, and structure. While Oprah would maintain the appearance of editorial independence, there were agreements about topics to be covered, areas to be avoided, and how to frame certain events. For Oprah, this wasn't unusual. High-profile interviews often involve layers of negotiation. But what would later come under scrutiny was the depth of that scripting. Meghan didn't walk into that interview as a grieving daughter-in-law with a story to tell. She came in prepared. Her team had reportedly briefed her on every possible reaction. They had shaped anecdotes into digestible sound bites. They had mapped out emotional arcs, when to pause, when to break, when to deliver a devastating line like a dagger. There were concerns and conversations about how dark his skin might be when he's born. That sentence alone sent shockwaves through the world. But what many didn't realize was just how well-rehearsed it may have been. At the time, Gayle King was among the loudest voices defending Meghan. She appeared on CBS This Morning following the interview, reinforcing Meghan's claims and condemning the palace's silence. She said Meghan and Harry had been trapped in a toxic institution, echoing the language used in the interview. For Gayle, who had long trusted Oprah's judgment, there was no reason to doubt the story. Oprah had given Meghan her stamp of approval, and Gayle followed suit. But beneath the surface, something else was growing. Other journalists began noticing inconsistencies. Dates that didn't match public records. Claims that conflicted with official palace timelines. Aides from inside the royal household began to murmur. And then came the whispers from people who had once worked with Meghan, staffers who described a very different woman from the one seen tearfully recalling suicidal thoughts on primetime television. They painted a picture not of a victim, but of a tactician. Still, Oprah and Gayle stood firm. Until the private communications started coming in. An anonymous tipster reportedly sent Oprah's team a cache of internal messages, emails, schedules, even voice notes, indicating that the most explosive moments of the interview had been practiced. There were notes referring to the race bomb, a chilling label for the most provocative line about Archie's skin tone. There were outlines for talking points, emotional cues, even anticipated audience reactions. Oprah, according to one of her longtime producers, was stunned, not just because the content raised doubts, but because she had trusted Meghan so implicitly. Oprah had built her career on the authenticity of human emotion. Now she was facing the possibility that one of her most powerful interviews had been nothing more than a monologue, performed to perfection. In private, she confided in Gayle. The conversation, insiders say, was one of the hardest of their decades-long friendship. Gayle had gone to bat for Meghan. Now she was hearing that the very foundation of that defense might be false. It was during one of these quiet debriefings, far from the cameras and public statements, that a decision was made. If the evidence continued to mount, if the truth turned out to be what they feared, they would go public. Not in a tabloid frenzy, but in a deliberate, careful manner. They would correct the record, not out of revenge, but out of a sense of responsibility. For Oprah, this was about more than reputation. It was about legacy. The 2021 interview had become a defining cultural moment. She could not allow it to stand unchallenged if it had, in fact, been built on manipulation. For Gayle, it was about credibility. As a journalist, she could not continue to support a narrative that had begun to crumble. The seeds of disillusionment had been planted. The stage was set, and the once powerful alliance between Oprah, Gayle, and Meghan was now entering its most fragile phase. On the evening of March 7, 2021, millions of viewers across the globe sat transfixed as Oprah Winfrey, the undisputed queen of emotional revelation, leaned in across a manicured Montecito garden and asked Meghan Markle, "Were you silent, or were you silenced?" It was the kind of question only Oprah could ask, direct, piercing, and pregnant with implication. Meghan's measured pause, her almost imperceptible nod, and her quiet reply. The latter detonated the first of many emotional bombs in what would become one of the most influential and divisive televised interviews of the decade. This wasn't just a conversation. It was a declaration. Meghan, a former Hollywood actress turned Duchess of Sussex, had returned to the American stage, this time as a woman allegedly broken by the oldest monarchy on earth. And she had chosen the only woman powerful enough to legitimize her story in the eyes of an international audience, Oprah Winfrey. Sitting beside her was Prince Harry, whose discomfort was as palpable as Meghan's poise. Together, they unfolded a narrative of institutional cruelty, racial insensitivity, and emotional despair. Oprah's nods gave it gravity. Meghan's tears gave it authenticity. And Harry's clipped, sometimes bitter interjections gave it fuel. What viewers saw that night was presented as the unraveling of a royal fairy tale. Meghan spoke of being silenced by palace aides, of not being allowed to seek mental health support when suicidal thoughts consumed her. She recalled a moment when a senior royal allegedly asked how dark her unborn child's skin might be. Harry spoke of being trapped, of his brother and father being trapped, and of history repeating itself, a haunting reference to the fate of his mother, Princess Diana. The world reacted swiftly and viscerally. Hashtags trended. Morning shows cleared their schedules. Pundits picked apart every syllable. In the United States, especially, Meghan became a symbol, not just of royal rebellion, but of racial resilience. Her story resonated with millions of women of color who saw their own experiences mirrored in her account of coded exclusion and subtle dismissal. Oprah, as always, was the trusted gatekeeper, the validator of trauma. If Meghan had come to her, it meant her pain was real. In Britain, the reaction was more divided. While many expressed horror at the allegations, others were skeptical. Piers Morgan famously stormed off the set of Good Morning Britain after being challenged on his scathing dismissal of Meghan's claims. The palace, for its part, issued a terse statement. Recollections may vary. It was as close to a public contradiction as the monarchy was likely to deliver, and it landed like a cold splash of water amid the feverish conversation. But as the dust began to settle, journalists, researchers, and palace staff started to analyze the interview more closely. Beneath the polished surface, inconsistencies began to emerge. The first to draw widespread attention was the claim that Meghan and Harry had been married 3 days before the public royal wedding. That story quickly fell apart when the Archbishop of Canterbury clarified that what Meghan described was a private exchange of vows, not a legal ceremony. Other claims, like the story about the palace taking away Harry's security and not offering Archie a title, also came under scrutiny. Royal protocol dictated that only the grandchildren of the monarch automatically received titles, a rule in place long before Meghan entered the royal scene. Still, in the days and weeks following the interview, the emotional impact lingered. For Oprah, it was another masterstroke in her legacy of emotionally resonant interviews. For Meghan and Harry, it was the moment they cemented their identities outside the constraints of royal life. Brand Sussex was no longer just a couple, it was a cause. The interview had done what few public relations campaigns ever could. It rebranded them from wayward royals to truth-telling survivors of institutional abuse. But as time passed, the undercurrents of doubt became harder to ignore. For viewers who rewatched the interview with fresh eyes, certain phrases felt oddly rehearsed. Meghan's anecdote about being told she couldn't leave the house because she was everywhere right now, while emotionally gripping, was difficult to corroborate, especially considering her continued public engagements around that time. Her claim that she had to hand over her passport, keys, and driver's license to palace aides also raised questions, given her documented travel and social life during that period. Journalists and biographers began digging deeper. Some former royal staffers, speaking under anonymity, described a different version of Meghan's time in the palace, one marked not by suppression, but by control. She wanted everything her way, said one insider. She didn't want to adapt to the monarchy. She wanted the monarchy to adapt to her. For many royal watchers, this was the key to understanding the fallout. Meghan's American sense of individualism clashed violently with the institution's demand for anonymity and duty. Behind the scenes, Oprah and her production team were beginning to feel the pressure. Questions were being asked, not just of Meghan and Harry, but of Oprah herself. Did she do enough to fact-check the claims? Did she push hard enough in the moment? Was this truly an interview, or was it a platform? Sources inside Harpo Productions began to leak subtle details. Oprah had not been given unrestricted access. Certain questions were off-limits. Meghan had final approval over location, wardrobe, and even the pre-interview camera tests. This wasn't necessarily unusual for celebrity interviews, but given the serious nature of the allegations being presented, it raised ethical concerns. Critics pointed out that Oprah had pushed harder in previous interviews, with Michael Jackson's accusers, with Lance Armstrong, even with Tom Cruise. But with Meghan and Harry, the tone had been gentler, more reverent. Gayle King, meanwhile, was becoming a key defender in the media. On CBS this morning, she dismissed the critics, saying the couple had been brutally honest and that their pain was real and valid. But even Gayle couldn't ignore the mounting questions. She began reaching out to other journalists, asking careful, quiet questions about inconsistencies. What she heard troubled her. What she didn't yet know, and what would soon rock both her and Oprah, was that members of Meghan's own circle were beginning to speak out. Privately. Cautiously. But truthfully. One former friend of Meghan's, who had distanced herself following the Sussexes' exit from royal duties, described the interview as crafted. She rehearsed it like a script, the friend reportedly said. Every pause, every anecdote. She knew exactly how to land those lines. Another source who worked closely with Meghan during her royal tenure confirmed that the concern over skin tone claim had been strategically withheld from palace discussions until the interview aired, a move many now believe was designed to deliver maximum shock. All of this reached Oprah in waves, whispers, leaks, anonymous emails. At first, she brushed them off as tabloid gossip. But the sources weren't just random. They included people she knew, people she trusted. They weren't accusing Meghan of lying outright. What they were saying was more dangerous, that she had curated the truth. For Oprah, who had staked her legacy on authenticity, this was devastating. Her interviews had always been grounded in the belief that vulnerability breeds healing. But what if the vulnerability she showcased to the world had been engineered? And what of Harry? His role in the interview had initially seemed secondary, the loyal husband defending his wife. But over time, his comments began to be viewed differently. His claim that he had been cut off financially by the royal family was disputed by royal accountants. His accusation that his father had stopped taking his calls was countered by insiders who said Charles had begged him to stay. Even his suggestion that his brother was trapped raised eyebrows, considering William's long-standing commitment to royal duty. By the fall of 2021, the interview, once heralded as a cultural turning point, was now a subject of division and debate. Oprah, Gayle, and their teams were feeling the weight of credibility. Oprah's silence on the matter became increasingly conspicuous. She had never been one to back down from tough truths. But this time, she was caught between loyalty and legacy. Privately, Oprah was beginning to express doubts. She shared her concerns with Gayle, whose own position was now deeply conflicted. Gayle had defended Meghan on air. To walk back those comments now would be to admit complicity in a deception. But she also knew what was at stake, not just for Oprah, but for journalism itself. This chapter of the saga ends not with a bang, but with a quiet tension. The interview, once a beacon of liberation, was now under forensic examination. The people who had lifted it to historic heights were beginning to wonder if they had helped create a myth. The shift was subtle at first. A few passing comments, some late-night conversations, and moments of private reflection that left Oprah quieter than usual. Those close to her described it as a slow unraveling, not of her public poise, but of her inner certainty. For a woman who had built her entire empire on trust in her guests, in their stories, and in the power of raw human honesty, to begin doubting the very foundation of one of her most explosive interviews wasn't just emotionally taxing. It was existential. The 2021 Meghan and Harry interview had catapulted Oprah back into the center of the global media spotlight. It was her most-watched special in years, drawing over 17 million viewers in the U.S. alone and igniting a firestorm of commentary that ricocheted across continents. Oprah had played the role she knew so well: compassionate listener, probing truth seeker, the wise confidant who gave the voiceless a voice. And Meghan had stepped into that moment like an actress meeting her long-awaited lead role. But after the applause faded and the cultural reverberations began to cool, the second wave hit: the scrutiny. Journalists, biographers, royal insiders, and palace staffers began re-watching the interview with a different lens, piecing together timelines, statements, and third-party confirmations. For Oprah, the doubts didn't come all at once. They came in fragments. The first came from a producer who had worked on the interview's post-production. During a routine debrief with Oprah's senior team, she raised a question about the authenticity of some of the spontaneous moments in Meghan's responses. She paused a beat too long at certain moments, the producer said, like someone who knew what was coming. At first, Oprah brushed it off. Meghan had been under intense emotional pressure. That could explain the pacing. But the comment lingered. Then came the internal memos. Harpo Productions had quietly begun reviewing all footage, correspondence, and notes associated with the special. It was standard practice, part of their archival process. But what began as an organizational review soon turned up inconsistencies. Meghan's team had sent a document days before filming, not unusual in itself, but this one contained detailed, thematic bullet points, recommended transitions, and suggestions for how to guide the narrative. The wording was cautious, even diplomatic, but the implication was clear. This wasn't a spontaneous outpouring of truth. It was a constructed performance. Still, Oprah remained hesitant to make assumptions. She had seen countless interviews over the decades, and it wasn't uncommon for public figures to organize their thoughts in advance. But there was something about the specificity of Meghan's document that unsettled her. One section in particular caught her attention, a note about how to phrase the royal race concern to elicit maximum empathy without direct accusations. That line stopped Oprah cold. Was it strategy masquerading as sincerity? Oprah's doubts deepened further when a well-respected royal historian, someone she had consulted privately during the pre-interview research, reached out again. There are parts of Meghan's account that simply don't align with known royal protocols, the historian said. We've checked dates, security records, internal reports. Some things don't add up. He wasn't dismissive. In fact, he had initially believed Meghan's account. But the more he examined the details, the less coherent the timeline became. At this point, Oprah's internal compass began to shift. It wasn't about disbelieving Meghan entirely. It was about separating the emotional truth from the factual truth and recognizing when the two had been blurred beyond recognition. What truly began to gnaw at Oprah, though, was her own reflection in all of this. Had she, in her desire to amplify a silenced voice, ignored her journalistic instincts? Had she been so invested in the story that she'd overlooked the signals? These questions haunted her, especially in quiet moments when she revisited the raw footage. One night, weeks after the historian's call, Oprah reportedly watched the interview in its entirety again, this time alone, without her production team, without distractions. She paid attention to the pacing, to Meghan's body language, to the way Harry shifted uncomfortably in certain moments. She rewound sections repeatedly. There was a moment where Meghan claimed she didn't know anything about the royal family before marrying into it, that she hadn't even Googled Harry. Oprah had accepted the statement at face value in the moment. But now, knowing how meticulous Meghan had been in planning the interview, it felt disingenuous. Then came the correspondence from a former palace staffer, a discreet but credible figure with years of experience inside Kensington Palace. The message, which arrived through a mutual contact, contained records of Meghan's communications with royal advisors, some of which contradicted claims she made in the interview. There were emails requesting changes to press releases, demands for specific language, and a detailed briefing Meghan had received before her first royal engagement. The staffer, who had watched the Oprah interview with shock and disbelief, claimed Meghan's portrayal of palace life was not just exaggerated, it was, in some cases, fabricated. By now, Oprah was no longer simply questioning parts of the story. She was reevaluating the entire framework. She brought these concerns to Gayle King, who had already begun her own quiet investigation. Gayle had heard rumblings from CBS colleagues who were uneasy with the way she had publicly defended Meghan without caveats. She had also begun hearing from media insiders who suggested that Meghan's relationship with the truth was more elastic than previously assumed. The conversation between Oprah and Gayle was, by all accounts, emotionally raw. Oprah reportedly confessed, "I feel like I handed her my credibility, and she used it as a shield." Gayle didn't argue. She felt the same. Both women had spent their careers cultivating trust with their audiences, and now that trust felt compromised. Still, they weren't prepared to go public, not yet. Oprah was methodical. She wanted more than hunches and anecdotes. She wanted confirmation. So she instructed her legal and research team to conduct a quiet but thorough inquiry into all publicly available records, timelines, and documentation surrounding the interview's claims. What they found reinforced her growing suspicions. There were gaps, glaring ones. Meghan's account of being denied help for mental health struggles, for instance, lacked documentation or corroboration. Several senior palace aides, speaking under anonymity to third-party investigators, claimed no such requests had ever been made, and that, had they been, the palace would have acted immediately. One aide provided a log showing that Meghan had, in fact, attended a private medical consultation around that time, contradicting her assertion that she was completely cut off. Then there was the issue of Archie's title. Meghan had claimed her son was denied the title of prince because of concerns about his race. But royal protocol stated that titles were reserved for the grandchildren of the reigning monarch, a rule that applied to all, regardless of race. Archie, as the great-grandchild of Queen Elizabeth at the time, was not entitled to a princely title unless the Queen intervened. The Queen had not, and had made the same decision for other great-grandchildren, including the children of Princess and Prince Edward. These factual corrections began to erode the emotional resonance of the interview. Oprah, who had always prided herself on championing underdogs, now feared she had amplified a narrative that was at best misleading and at worst intentionally deceptive. But what hurt most wasn't the inaccuracies. It was the betrayal of trust. Oprah had approached the interview in good faith. She had extended her platform to Meghan and Harry with the understanding that they were seeking truth and healing. What she now suspected was that they had instead been seeking vindication and were willing to bend the truth to get it. The personal fallout began quietly. Oprah stopped returning Meghan's calls. Gayle removed herself from speaking engagements where Meghan's name would come up. Harpo Productions suspended plans for a follow-up special. Internally, a shift occurred. From belief to investigation, from amplification to retraction. Friends noticed the difference in Oprah. She was still composed, still gracious, but her usual warmth had dulled. She was, as one friend put it, wrestling with the weight of having been deceived. For someone who had built an empire on empathy, discovering that her empathy had been exploited left scars. And still, Oprah hesitated to speak publicly. She knew that one word from her could destroy Meghan's carefully constructed narrative. She didn't want to be a part of that, not out of loyalty to Meghan, but out of responsibility to the broader conversation. If the story was going to be corrected, it had to be done carefully, thoroughly, and without the rancor that had come to define modern media takedowns. This was no longer just a royal scandal. It was a personal reckoning for one of the most trusted women in media history. While Oprah Winfrey wrestled with private disillusionment, struggling with the weight of a potential betrayal that struck at the core of her life's work, her closest confidant was undergoing a similar but uniquely personal unraveling. For Gayle King, the unraveling of the Meghan Markle narrative wasn't simply a matter of public perception or professional ethics, it was also a question of trust, image, and her own position as a journalist deeply tethered to Oprah's gravitational pull. Gayle King had, from the beginning, been one of Meghan and Harry's staunchest defenders in American media. She had, on numerous occasions, repeated and reinforced their claims on CBS. She had acted as a bridge between the couple and the public, often sharing updates from inside the Sussex's inner circle that had not been formally released. In the aftermath of the Oprah interview, Gayle had even gone so far as to publicly call out the British press for their treatment of Meghan, and she openly supported the couple's decision to step back from royal duties. For a long time, she was more than a journalist covering a story, she was an advocate operating within the very narrative she helped promote. And for a while, it worked. The public, especially in the U.S., largely accepted the framing of Meghan as a victimized outsider. Gayle's visibility and sincerity bolstered that perception. When Meghan was criticized, Gayle defended her. When tabloids pushed back, Gayle countered. She wasn't just a commentator, she was a guardrail, a validator of Meghan's version of events. But privately, cracks were forming. Colleagues at CBS started quietly expressing concern. During production meetings, Gayle was increasingly met with cautious glances whenever Meghan's name came up. Several producers reportedly warned her that continuing to uncritically amplify Meghan's claims could jeopardize her credibility, especially as inconsistencies and counter-narratives emerged. Gayle, known for her directness and calm demeanor, didn't lash out, but she did begin to listen. It was around this time that Gayle received a message from an old friend in London. A seasoned broadcaster who had covered the royal beat for over 2 decades. The message was blunt. You may want to take a second look at the foundation of that story. There are things you haven't been told. Attached were 3 internal royal memos that had been quietly circulated to senior media correspondents after the Oprah interview. These documents, while not made public, outlined key discrepancies between Meghan's claims and actual records from the palace. Gayle, stunned but skeptical, forwarded the documents to a trusted contact within Harpo Productions, the same contact who had been assisting Oprah's own internal review. The response she received was unsettling. We've seen these. We're trying to figure out how deep it goes. Suddenly, Gayle was no longer outside the controversy, offering commentary from a safe distance. She was inside it, tangled in a web that now threatened to stain her own journalistic integrity. And as she began rewatching her past interviews, the ones where she confidently repeated Meghan's talking points, the segments where she questioned palace denials without hesitation, a feeling of discomfort took root. What if she had been misled? What if she had unknowingly become a mouthpiece in a performance orchestrated for maximum impact? Gayle began to withdraw, not from her job, but from her visible association with Meghan. Invitations to appear on panels about royal coverage were quietly declined. Opportunities to write opinion pieces supporting the Sussexes were passed over. When she was asked to host a follow-up segment revisiting the Oprah interview 1 year later, she gave a diplomatic, "Not right now." Her team, recognizing the shift, understood that something had changed. Still, Gayle hadn't spoken to Oprah in depth about the matter. Their friendship was deep and long-standing, but the Meghan fallout was delicate. Gayle didn't want to jump to conclusions or betray Oprah's sense of loyalty. But eventually, the 2 women met in private at Oprah's estate in Santa Barbara, far from the cameras and the speculation. According to someone familiar with the conversation, it was not planned as an intervention or a confrontation. It was a reckoning. Gayle arrived carrying a folder of documents, printed emails, news clippings, and a timeline annotated in her own handwriting. Oprah, always prepared, had already laid out her own notes on the kitchen counter. What followed was a 4-hour conversation marked by long pauses, quiet revelations, and moments of shared frustration. Gayle reportedly told Oprah, "I feel like I helped build this platform, and now I don't know if I was building it on truth." Oprah didn't argue. She confessed her own growing doubts, her sleepless nights, and her fear that she had allowed her emotions and her personal sympathies to override her professional discipline. Gayle nodded in agreement. She too had felt that pull-eye. The desire to believe Meghan's story, to champion her against the powerful institution of monarchy. But now, armed with information that painted a far murkier picture, both women were reckoning with the consequences. One particularly emotional moment came when Gayle referred to the infamous skin tone allegation. "We never asked the right follow-up," she reportedly said. "We let that just sit. We let the world fill in the blanks." Oprah was silent for a long time before replying, "I didn't push because I didn't want to break her. But maybe that was a mistake." That conversation was a turning point for Gayle. Afterward, she began taking deliberate steps to reclaim her journalistic independence. She instructed her team at CBS to begin vetting any future Sussex-related content more rigorously. She distanced herself from exclusive updates connected to Meghan's inner circle. When Meghan and Harry made headlines for their Spotify fallout, Gayle made no comment, a noticeable departure from her past engagement with their stories. And when Meghan's letter to King Charles regarding unconscious bias in the royal family leaked, Gayle refrained from joining the chorus of outrage. The silence was telling. But Gayle didn't stop at quiet distancing. She began to reach out to journalists who had been skeptical from the beginning, including a British investigative reporter who had been openly critical of the Oprah interview's narrative. Their conversation was described as measured and professional, but it revealed something deeper. Gayle was seeking not just confirmation, but redemption. She wanted to understand where she had gone wrong, how someone as experienced as herself had allowed a potentially fabricated story to dominate her coverage for so long. That reporter shared something that struck Gayle to her core. It wasn't that the story was unbelievable, he said. It was that it was too perfectly structured, too symmetrical. Real trauma is messy. It doesn't land on cue. That phrase stuck with her for days. Gayle's awakening wasn't filled with scandal or fireworks. There were no press releases, no explosive interviews. It was a quiet withdrawal, a recalibration of her professional compass. Her tone on her shifted subtly. She no longer invoked Meghan's name in discussions of media bias or racial injustice. She spoke more broadly, more cautiously. She had learned the cost of tying her name to a narrative not yet proven. Meanwhile, Meghan's team had noticed the change. Invitations for appearances were no longer extended to Gayle. Requests for private dinners went unanswered. A source close to Meghan reportedly described Gayle's silence as the betrayal. But to Gayle, it wasn't betrayal. It was accountability. She hadn't turned on Meghan. She had simply stepped back to observe with clearer eyes. As Oprah continued her own quiet investigation into the integrity of the 2021 interview, she leaned more heavily on Gayle, not just for moral support, but for strategic insight. Together, they began outlining how to address what was becoming increasingly clear. They had helped amplify a narrative that might not have been entirely true. Gayle King had taken a step back, but that step was not one of cowardice or disloyalty. It was the act of a woman recognizing the weight of her voice and choosing to wield it with renewed responsibility. When it comes to exposing a house of cards, it is often the quiet leak, not the loud accusation, that triggers the collapse. In the weeks that followed Oprah and Gayle's private reckoning, a new and deeply unsettling development emerged. This one would be far harder to dismiss. While doubts had begun to gather like storm clouds over Meghan Markle's 2021 interview, it wasn't until private conversations and correspondence, never meant to see daylight, were leaked that the house of narrative finally began to crack in full view. It began with a whisper. A journalist working for a mid-tier European outlet claimed to have access to internal planning documents related to Meghan's appearance on Oprah. At first, the claim didn't garner much attention. After all, rumors surrounding the Sussexes had become so common that many dismissed new revelations as part of the tabloid noise. But this time, the journalist had more than anonymous hearsay. She had receipts. What she reportedly uncovered were a series of internal communications between Meghan's public relations advisors and a third-party production consultant who had worked indirectly on prepping the interview setting. These documents contained what could only be described as media framing memos. These weren't light guidelines or open-ended suggestions. They were deliberate, calculated strategies. Notes on how Meghan should phrase certain experiences, how to transition emotionally from one anecdote to another, and, most jarring of all, how to present her truth in a way that neutralized scrutiny while maximizing viewer empathy. One note stood out among the rest. It allegedly instructed, pivot from institutional racism to personal vulnerability. Mention suicidal ideation shortly after royal baby discussion. Empathy builds trust. To any media strategist, this was textbook crisis communications. To Oprah and Gayle, once made aware of this leak, it was betrayal wrapped in method. This document leak was just the beginning. Within days of the first article breaking the story, other sources began coming forward, anonymously at first, then more openly. A former junior staffer who worked on the production crew of the interview contacted a veteran investigative journalist in Los Angeles and shared audio recordings of pre-interview discussions. On one of the tapes, Meghan could allegedly be heard rehearsing lines with a senior advisor. She says she's feeling emotionally overwhelmed. A voice on the tape notes. Meghan responds, "Right, and I'll pause just before I mention the baby, like I'm gathering myself. Then I'll lean forward." The tone wasn't cold or theatrical. It was methodical. It was the voice of someone preparing to control not just the message, but the mood of an entire audience. What made these leaks especially damning was not that Meghan had rehearsed. Public figures often prepare for interviews, especially ones of such high stakes. What disturbed Oprah and Gayle was the illusion that it was all spontaneous, raw, and painfully authentic. The world had been told this was Meghan's unfiltered truth. The evidence now suggested that what viewers had seen was a meticulously curated performance. Back at Harpo Productions, internal staff were shaken. Some felt deceived. Others felt complicit. A few had raised questions early on but were dismissed as being too journalistically rigid for a new era of emotional storytelling. Now, those very concerns were coming back in full force. Meetings were called. Legal teams began poring over contracts and disclosures. While nothing illegal had occurred, the ethical implications were enormous. For Oprah, it was a moment of internal collapse. When the audio and document leaks were brought to her attention by a trusted legal advisor, she reportedly said nothing at first. She sat in silence, listening to one of the tapes on a loop. When it ended, she reportedly murmured, "I asked her for honesty, not a monologue." Oprah had trusted that the emotional vulnerability Meghan had shown on camera came from a place of raw experience. She had leaned into that vulnerability as the foundation for how the interview was framed, edited, and eventually broadcast. Now, that foundation was eroding. The line between storytelling and manipulation was no longer a blur, it was a chasm. Gayle King received the same materials the next day. Her reaction, sources say, was less shocked and more resolute. She had already begun distancing herself. This, to her, was confirmation. She reportedly told her CBS producer, "We were played. And not just us, everyone." But the scandal didn't remain contained in private conversations and newsroom whispers for long. A second, more explosive leak surfaced within a week. This time, it came from someone within Meghan's own former PR agency, an individual who had worked directly with the Sussexes during their first months of independence after leaving the royal family. This individual provided emails that indicated Meghan's team had not only shaped the content of the Oprah interview, but had coordinated with sympathetic U.S. media figures in the days leading up to the broadcast. These included pre-written talking points, recommended social media hashtags, and even suggested headlines for friendly outlets. One email, allegedly sent just 48 hours before the interview aired, read, "Push the narrative of bravery, isolation, and systemic prejudice. Frame Harry as protector, Meghan as survivor. Avoid all discussions of past staff complaints until further notice." That sentence, "avoid all discussions of past staff complaints," struck like lightning. It pointed directly to a key issue that had been largely ignored during the interview: the bullying allegations lodged by former Kensington Palace staffers against Meghan. At the time, these allegations had been dismissed as distractions, possibly even as part of a smear campaign. But if her team had actively worked to suppress those narratives in the media while amplifying others, it suggested a high-level operation to shape not just a personal story but a public persona. By now, media outlets around the world had picked up on the leaks. The British press ran with it. American outlets, more cautious, began conducting their own investigations. Harpo Productions was inundated with requests for comment. Oprah refused to speak publicly, but insiders confirmed that she was deeply hurt and actively reevaluating the interview's place in her legacy. Her legal team, while quiet, reportedly began reviewing Meghan's pre-interview disclosures for any breach of ethics. In parallel, Gayle King took her own action. Without drawing attention, she authorized her research staff at CBS to re-examine the original interview against newly uncovered timelines and documents. What they found only deepened the sense of betrayal. Dates were off. Descriptions didn't match available public records. Claims about not being given assistance for mental health issues lacked corroborating evidence. And the biggest red flag? The skin tone conversation. The most headline-grabbing part of the interview remained unverifiable, with no actual name attached and no witness besides Harry himself. For Oprah and Gayle, this wasn't just a professional crisis. It was personal. These were women who had spent decades building careers rooted in trust. They had mentored others, broken barriers, and raised standards for storytelling in an age saturated with misinformation. Now they were staring down the reality that their platforms, once bastions of truth, had potentially been used to launder a curated lie. One Harpo staffer summed it up quietly in a closed-door meeting. "We weren't just the microphone. We were the amplifier. And we never knew it." Outside the media bubble, public reaction was intense and divisive. Some loyal fans of Meghan continued to defend her, accusing the press of targeting her unfairly. Others, especially those who had once believed her story without question, expressed a sense of emotional betrayal. The divide was no longer just between pro- and anti-royal camps. It was now a matter of integrity, of whether people felt manipulated by the story they had once embraced. Activists who had previously rallied around Meghan as a symbol of anti-racist resistance now began reevaluating their positions. One civil rights leader, who had appeared on a panel defending Meghan after the Oprah interview, released a statement: "We stood by her because we believed her pain. If that pain was exaggerated or used for leverage, it undermines real survivors and real movements." In the days following the second wave of leaks, Oprah and Gayle met again, this time with their legal teams and senior producers. What was said in that meeting remains confidential. But one decision became clear in the aftermath: they would not continue to defend the interview as originally presented. While they stopped short of retracting it, both women made internal moves to prepare for a public acknowledgement. One that would likely come not in a press release, but in the form of a new documentary project focused on truth and media. For Oprah, it was a reckoning long in the making. For Gayle, it was a line in the sand. And for Meghan Markle, it was the beginning of the most consequential unraveling of her carefully constructed public image. For decades, Oprah Winfrey has stood as one of the most unshakable icons in modern media. She's not only interviewed presidents, kings, and Hollywood's elite, she's created a global brand centered on vulnerability, truth, and emotional authenticity. So when reports began surfacing that Oprah herself had privately expressed regret over the Meghan Markle interview, the shock wasn't merely that she had changed her mind, it was that she had, for the first time in years, felt personally manipulated in a way she couldn't ignore. The comment, at first, was shared only within an extremely tight circle, one that included a few of her senior producers, longtime friend Gayle King, and 2 legal advisors. It was during a post-leak meeting, amid rising tensions and swirling emotions, that Oprah had reportedly uttered the words that would soon reverberate across the media world: "I feel used." This wasn't transparency, it was theater. The remark was made in a moment of quiet, according to one person in the room. There was no rage, no loud denouncement, just an overwhelming weariness. Oprah's tone, described as both saddened and reflective, made it clear that this was not a hasty conclusion. It had come after weeks of deep internal conflict, private review of the interview footage, and an overwhelming flood of new evidence that challenged the credibility of the narrative she had so publicly helped launch. Still, this was Oprah Winfrey. She did not intend for the comment to become public. Her brand had been built, brick by brick, on discretion and discipline. But in an era of constant leaks and digital whispers, nothing remains private for long. Just days later, an anonymous insider who had attended one of the internal Harpo meetings shared the quote with a trusted journalist. The reporter, unsure whether it was off the record, reached out to several media outlets with a simple but devastating pitch: "Oprah feels betrayed by Meghan." That was all it took. Within 24 hours, speculation ignited. Twitter threads exploded with theories. News blogs and royal watchers began citing anonymous sources. Soon, more credible voices began to weigh in. A veteran producer who had worked with Oprah for over a decade told one outlet, "I can't speak for everything she feels, but yes, I think she believes she was misled, and that's not something she takes lightly." Publicly, Harpo Productions issued no statement. Oprah herself remained silent. But Gayle King, who had already begun her own withdrawal from the Meghan circle, was reportedly furious about the leak, not because it wasn't true, but because she knew it had come too soon. There was no plan in place, no formal recalibration, just a raw admission that had slipped into the public domain and was now spiraling beyond anyone's control. But even though it wasn't intentional, the leak did something profound. It punctured the illusion that Oprah was still on board with Meghan's version of events. And with that illusion gone, the floodgates opened. Other sources close to Oprah began to speak up, not in betrayal, but in clarification. One longtime friend shared that Oprah had been deeply affected by the revelations from inside Meghan's team. "She's not angry in the way you'd expect," the friend said. "She's not shouting or seeking revenge. It's more like she's mourning something. Not just the story, but the trust she placed in Meghan." Another member of Oprah's production crew was more blunt. "We all drank the Kool-Aid," he said. "The messaging, the pacing of the interview, the framing, it was all too perfect. And now, with all these leaks, it's clear why. It was orchestrated. And we didn't see it because we didn't want to. Inside Harpo, the emotional atmosphere was heavy. Staff members who had worked tirelessly on the interview felt blindsided, not just by the leaked documents, but by the implication that they had helped mislead millions. Many were young, idealistic, and had seen their work on the special as a turning point in the global conversation around racism and royalty. Now, some were questioning whether they had amplified a personal vendetta instead of exposing systemic truth. For Oprah, the betrayal wasn't limited to factual inconsistencies or reputational risk. It was emotional. She had seen in Meghan a reflection of her younger self, a woman of color navigating hostile systems, trying to speak her truth in a world not built to hear it. Oprah had believed her fiercely. She had offered not just a platform, but her name, her brand, her legacy. And now, she feared that what she had offered had been used not for healing, but for spectacle. According to insiders, one of Oprah's most painful realizations came when she rewatched the moment Meghan dropped the skin tone bombshell. There were concerns and conversations about how dark his skin might be when he's born. It was the line that changed everything, that lit a fuse beneath Buckingham Palace and sent media pundits scrambling across the globe. In real time, Oprah's reaction had gone viral. Her wide eyes, the barely audible "what?" followed by a stunned silence. It was the image that launched headlines, memes, and hashtags. But now, in retrospect, Oprah saw it differently. She reportedly told a close associate, that moment, the one everyone replayed, "It was real for me, but it wasn't real for her. That's what hurts the most." The idea that she had become a prop in someone else's script was intolerable, not because of ego, but because of the gravity of the subjects they had touched: racism, suicide, isolation. Oprah had built her reputation on treating those topics with reverence. And if even one of Meghan's claims had been manipulated for effect, then the sanctity of that conversation, and everything it stood for, was compromised. The backlash was swift, and it cut in every direction. Royal defenders seized the leak as vindication, declaring that the interview had always been exaggerated, if not outright deceitful. Meghan's supporters scrambled to explain the leak away, suggesting that Oprah's words had been taken out of context or misunderstood. Some claimed that the entire controversy was being manufactured by royal sympathizers in an attempt to discredit Meghan's broader message. But inside the media industry, few doubted the authenticity of the quote. Oprah had said what she said, and even if she hadn't intended it to go public, it was now part of the permanent record. And with that one leaked remark, a domino effect began. Several A-list celebrities who had once publicly aligned themselves with Meghan began backing away. One well-known actress quietly asked to be removed from the advisory board of a charity Meghan had supported. A major media executive who had greenlit a development deal with Archwell Audio told a reporter that the tone at the top has changed. These weren't loud, angry exits. They were subtle, but they were unmistakable. What made the situation even more volatile was Meghan's silence. After the leaks, she released no statement. Her representatives declined all interview requests. Even the Sussexes' usually vocal social media support base seemed muted. It was as if the entire operation had gone into bunker mode, trying to ride out the storm with the hope that it would eventually pass. But the storm was not passing. It was growing. More leaks began surfacing, small things at first, drafts of media pitches, early versions of talking points shared with journalists before the Oprah interview, emails showing how carefully narratives were being shaped and distributed. Each leak didn't just challenge a single claim. It challenged the very idea that the Oprah interview had been an unfiltered, organic moment of truth. For Oprah, the path forward was now filled with hard decisions. According to one Harpo executive, she had begun seriously considering a new project, one that would explore the weaponization of victimhood in modern media, the fine line between personal narrative and public manipulation, and how even well-meaning platforms can be hijacked by those with agendas. Some insiders described it as an act of catharsis. Others saw it as a way to reclaim control over a story that had spiraled far beyond its origin. But regardless of the motive, one thing was clear: Oprah was no longer defending the interview. She was reframing it. And that reframing began to manifest in small but significant ways. In her public speeches, Oprah began speaking more broadly about the importance of discernment in storytelling, about being aware of how trauma can be shaped, and the need for media figures to ask the right questions, even when it's hard. These comments weren't explicitly about Meghan, but those paying attention knew exactly what she meant. The Meghan interview, once a landmark of emotional disclosure, was now becoming a case study in narrative control, a cautionary tale rather than a triumph. The ripple effects were enormous. Media organizations began reviewing their interview protocols. Ethics panels at journalism schools used the interview as a topic of debate. Public opinion began to shift. Not dramatically, but enough to change the tone. Where there had once been unquestioning sympathy, there was now a healthy skepticism. And at the center of it all stood Oprah, a woman who had given her platform, her power, and her trust to someone who may have used it all for personal advantage. A woman who had always prided herself on knowing when someone was being authentic, and who now had to reckon with the possibility that, for the first time in decades, she had been fooled. It is often said that the true test of character is not how someone acts in moments of celebration, but how they respond when the walls begin to close in. For Meghan Markle, that moment came quietly, not with headlines or a dramatic confrontation, but with a silence that began to surround her like a fog. Friends who once answered her calls with excitement now hesitated. Allies in media who once went out of their way to defend her now took careful pauses before offering comment. And most distressingly, the one woman who had given her the most powerful platform in the world, Oprah Winfrey, had gone radio silent. At first, Meghan didn't panic. She was used to media firestorms. Over the years, she had been targeted, misunderstood, and slandered. Her instinct, honed through years of public relations training and professional acting, told her that this would pass too. The headlines would shift. Another scandal would dominate. And Oprah, in time, would call again. But this time, the storm didn't pass. It grew louder. And Oprah didn't call. As the leaks continued to make their rounds in media circles, the leaked production notes, the coaching memos, the pre-planned sound bites, Meghan became increasingly aware that something was slipping out of her control. The damage wasn't just external. It was internal. And it was personal. She began reaching out quietly, first through mutual friends. According to one individual familiar with the situation, Meghan initially asked for a meeting with Oprah at her home, requesting an informal sit-down to clear the air. But the request was gently declined. The message was polite but firm. Now may not be the right time. Undeterred, Meghan tried again, this time, sending a handwritten letter. The contents of that letter remained private, but according to those who saw it, it was a mix of emotion and explanation. She apologized for any misunderstandings. She reiterated that her pain during the interview had been real. She pleaded that any preparations made in advance were not manipulative but necessary. "I was scared," she reportedly wrote. "I needed the story to land right. I needed people to hear me." But the letter received no reply. With Oprah's silence growing louder, Meghan turned to Gayle King, someone she had once considered a dependable ally. Unlike Oprah, Gayle hadn't completely cut off communication. But her tone had changed. Where once there were friendly texts and warm exchanges, now there were long response times and curt acknowledgments. Meghan reportedly sent a series of voice notes to Gayle over the course of a week. In one of them, her voice cracked with emotion. "I feel like I'm losing everyone," she said. "I don't know who to trust anymore." Sources close to Gayle say she listened to the messages but didn't respond right away. She was torn. She didn't hate Meghan. She didn't even blame her in the way the public now seemed to. But she couldn't forget what had happened, the quiet misdirection, the incomplete truths presented as absolute. More than anything, she felt betrayed by the emotional manipulation. The way she put herself on the line, only to find that much of what she defended was more crafted than confessed. Eventually, Gayle responded with a simple text message. "You should speak to Oprah directly." It was a signal. Not a door slammed shut, but not one flung open either. Gayle was stepping back, no longer willing to act as a go-between or emotional buffer. If Meghan wanted redemption, she would need to face the woman she had hurt the most. But Oprah was still not ready. According to one close friend, Oprah was processing everything in her own time. She wasn't furious, but she was deeply disappointed. It wasn't just the misleading details of the interview. It was the knowledge that she had been used to orchestrate a global public relations campaign, one that had little to do with vulnerability and everything to do with power. Meghan, in the meantime, was beginning to feel the walls tighten. Media coverage, once sympathetic, had become cautious. Her Archwell projects were under increased scrutiny. Collaborators, once eager, now requested contract clauses protecting them from reputational damage. Her publicist urged her to lay low. Her lawyer advised silence. But Meghan wasn't just worried about her brand. She was worried about being completely cut off from the very circles that had once embraced her as a modern icon. There were attempts at damage control. A close associate of Meghan's leaked that she was considering a follow-up interview, perhaps not with Oprah, but with another sympathetic media outlet. The goal would be to clarify her previous remarks, to set the record straight. But the idea was met with resistance from her own inner circle. A follow-up interview could backfire. It could be seen as an admission of guilt. Worse, it could draw Oprah's quiet fury into public view. Behind the scenes, Meghan's team attempted to reach out to others in Oprah's orbit, producers, editors, even spiritual advisors. The message was consistent. Meghan wanted to talk. She wanted to explain. She wanted to be heard again, but this time not by millions, by one woman. Eventually, a short call was arranged. Oprah didn't initiate it, but she agreed to take it. The details of that call remain closely guarded, but sources familiar with both camps described it as tense, emotional, and unresolved. Meghan reportedly began with a heartfelt apology, saying she never intended to mislead anyone. She insisted that her experiences were real, that the pain she felt, the isolation, the depression, the racism, all of it was true to her lived experience. But Oprah didn't let it slide. She reportedly told Meghan, "You came to me with your story, and I gave you my platform because I believed it was the truth. Not your truth. The truth." The distinction landed hard. Meghan responded, attempting to clarify. She said the framing had been necessary, that she didn't fabricate, she simply curated. But Oprah was unmoved. She explained that journalism, even in its softest forms, demands integrity. And what she felt now was not just disappointment, it was a sense of having been co-opted. The call ended politely. There were no raised voices. But the chill remained. It was clear that whatever relationship had once existed between the two women had been changed irrevocably. They were no longer allies in shared storytelling. They were two women on opposite sides of a fracture, one who had trusted, and one who had taken that trust too far. After the call, Meghan reportedly broke down in tears. According to someone close to her, she was devastated. She thought Oprah would understand, the source said. She thought that if anyone would forgive her, it would be Oprah. In the days that followed, Meghan became even more isolated. Oprah offered no public condemnation, but her silence was loud enough. Gayle remained distantly cordial but no longer involved. The friendly press dried up. Interviews were declined. Collaboration stalled. There was even talk among Meghan's former advisors of reshaping her image entirely. Moving away from the victim narrative and toward a new chapter focused on motherhood, philanthropy, and advocacy. But the damage had already been done. The trust that had once carried her through scandal after scandal was now fractured, and the one relationship that could have shielded her from the worst of the fallout was no longer intact. Meghan had reached out. She had tried to salvage the friendship. She had apologized, explained, and pleaded. But some fractures, once formed, cannot be repaired with words alone. And the cost of losing Oprah's trust was not just personal, it was historic. In a shocking twist no one saw coming, Gayle King has broken ranks and joined Oprah in exposing what they now call one of the most calculated manipulations in modern media, all centered around Meghan Markle's explosive 2021 interview. Private emails, rehearsed answers, fabricated claims, even the royal skin tone allegation is now under serious doubt. Oprah, once a fierce defender, is devastated, telling insiders, this wasn't truth. It was theater. Why are Gayle and Oprah cutting ties now? What secrets are they uncovering, and what does this mean for Meghan's future in Hollywood and beyond? Stay tuned. The fallout is only just beginning.